My name is Greg Gretsch. I worked at Apple from 1988 to 1992. In 1990, I was the executive producer of the News Navigator, which was the first ever public display of QuickTime digital video in a production environment. In 1990, I worked in the higher education marketing group at Apple, and that fall, as with the prior, 5 or 6 years, we participated in a trade show called Educom. Educom was a higher education technology trade show. In prior years, Apple had produced the Educom Daily, which was for Apple a display of how well they did desktop publishing, which was obviously very big in the late 80s, early 90s, and also had provided kiosks for the attendees to be able to access their email systems back on their campuses. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, most people on college campuses were using email, even though it didn't come into broad use until much later. In the fall of 1990, the other vendors at the show, mostly IBM, didn't want Apple to do both desktop publishing and the kiosks. They wanted to show that they too could do desktop publishing. They really wanted to do that. So we said, great, you guys do the desktop publishing, we'll take the kiosks and find something interesting to do with the kiosks. That gave us the opportunity to produce what became the News Navigator. At the time, in my role in the higher education marketing group, I was working very closely with the advanced technology group, and I was introduced to a gentleman by the name of Eric Hoffert. And Eric is a mad scientist type, and he was one of the early fathers of what was at the time called Road Pizza, which was a very early QuickTime digital video algorithm to compress the videos. When I connected with him and we started talking about this, we came up with this idea of showing video on the computer screens for the kiosks at Educom. And we had the idea of maybe we could create a daily news magazine, which for us, the challenge was Apple's not a news company. This content wasn't readily available. I had gone to the University of Georgia, so I had some contacts back at the University of Georgia, and I reached out to a friend of mine, Clate Sanders, who I had met while I was a student rep at Apple working at the University of Georgia, and asked Clate if he had any contacts at CNN, keeping in mind CNN's in Atlanta. He did, and the two of us together went and met with the guys at CNN to talk about, hey, could we do some sort of a daily news magazine using your content at this trade show? It turned out that Educom in 1990 was in Atlanta, so it was right in CNN's backyard. And so with some conversation back and forth, they agreed to do it, and then it was up to us to assemble a team and figure out exactly how to do it, because no one had ever produced video on a daily basis for computers at that point. QuickTime didn't exist at that point as a product by Apple. In fact, QuickTime wasn't released until a year after we first showed it at Educom in Atlanta in 1990. It was a bunch of advanced technology group projects where they were looking at what video might look like on a computer. In 1990, pretty much no one had seen video running on a computer. If they had seen video running on a computer, it was likely a laser disc that was essentially pumping through the computer screen. No one had seen digital video files playing on a computer, and in fact, no one was really quite sure that they could make it work. So this was the first ever public display of digital video on a computer. And the product didn't actually become QuickTime until some time later. At that point, it was coming out of the Advanced Technology Group, ATG, and moving over to the product group. So it was in this kind of in-between state before they actually knew what they wanted to do with it as a product. The name News Navigator came from what at the time was an iconic video that Apple had produced for Educom several years earlier called the Knowledge Navigator. And the Knowledge Navigator video is this college professor sits down at his desk, opens up what looks a lot like an iPad today, but it's a two-screened iPad, and he's talking to his iPad. A lot of the technologies in the Knowledge Navigator are available today in slightly different forms. But that was a technology visionary statement or vision statement for Apple. And that technology vision statement was well recognized within the higher education community. So when we were searching for a name for what we were going to call this daily news magazine, the News Navigator was just a natural fit.
I'm Clate Sanders, and in 1990 I was in charge of interactive video and special projects and things like that at the University of Georgia. I worked with old tools like Laserdisc and things like that. I worked for the University of Georgia for many years. Everything from a still photographer to a videographer, a filmmaker, bureaucrat, those sorts of things. And I helped Greg start the Mac Users Club on campus. So we became friends that way. So when he needed some access to people at CNN, I got us into there. CNN was just cranking up something called the Checkout Channel. They had the airport channel and various outlets like that for analog video. So the video that John Petrovich of Headline News or CNN provided us was just the perfect length, little short videos that somebody would watch in a checkout lane at a supermarket.
Before the World Wide Web existed and hyperlinks existed, there was HyperCard. And HyperCard was the tool that gave non-sophisticated non-programmers the ability to create interactive content. Hyperlinks, really, I'm sure they predated HyperCard. The ideas came from someplace. But in terms of broad adoption, HyperCard was the first use of hyperlinks and linking from one piece of content to another.
I have no background in computer science. I had never done any computer program until Bill Atkinson wrote for the classic Mac a black and white program called HyperCard. Educators loved it because it was so easy. It was the most forgiving thing you can imagine. It didn't care about capital letters. It didn't care about extra spaces. It knew every abbreviation there was. You just typed, and essentially you could say, put that there. Get this out of this field, put it there. Change the name of this button to this. So it was easy for a non-programmer like me. And when it came about, I leapt on it. I wrote a lot of language software for education. I won some awards at Educom that same year. I was up on the stage with getting an award, just totally asleep because I hadn't been to bed in a few days. So HyperCard, the metaphor for a HyperCard was stacks. You had a bunch of cards and that was a stack. Educators used it for writing software for their classrooms, for teaching languages. Ordinary people used it for their contact list or to store their recipes or a list of all the audio cassettes they owned. It was just like a card catalog or something like that. And all these cards were linked and things like that.
So this was before QuickTime was a product. At the time, it was called Warhol. That was the code name for it. And it started out in the advanced technology group at Apple. One of the ways that they were running demos on this is they created a set of X commands. X commands are just extensions to HyperCard to be able to plug the Warhol functionality into HyperCard. That created the basis for us to build the framework, if you will, for us to build this daily news magazine on top of HyperCard.
A man named Peter Marks developed some X commands, practically on demand from us and the QuickTime team, to enable us to control X commands or external commands, and they can be added to the resource fork of HyperCard and available to control things and do things outside of HyperCard in the system folder and things like that. So we were controlling playing video, playing our movies with X commands. But HyperCard was basically written for the classic Mac. It was black and white, it was a small screen, and so I had to figure out some way to get color on it. Some programs later called color tools were added to HyperCard by third parties and other people. We also had X commands that let us overlay color on top of it to put in color graphics so that it looked cooler and match the video, which would be in color. Today we're accustomed to the high resolution iPhone screens of millions of pixels. In those days our screen was 640 by 480. You can do the math. So it wasn't many pixels. If we were able to take this screen and put it on an iPhone, it would be up in the corner, very small, and if we tried to then blow it up to fill the screen, it would look all pixelated and everything bad on your iPhone. This is not analog video, this is digital. So every pixel on the screen has to be addressed. Today we think of QuickTime as this program that plays video, but Bruce and some of the other people would have corrected you and say, no, QuickTime is an architecture, and inside of QuickTime are all these codecs for compressor, decompressor. And the one we used was called Road Pizza, because it was a compression format. I'll let you guess what Road Pizza means, because it's something else that gets compressed out on our highways.
The production of the News Navigator was a really big undertaking. No one had ever taken analog video to digital and produced it with new video coming in on a daily basis. Today, obviously, all the video you shoot is digital. It goes digital to digital. These things can happen quickly. Something happens in the world, and within tenths of a second, you're seeing it broadcast around the world digitally. This actually took a lot of time capturing the video, a lot of time assembling the stories, and then a lot of time distributing to all the systems that were out there. It was not very stable. Most of the software that we were using wasn't production software, and so things kept on breaking through the day. As a result, this was a 24/7 operation. The team that was working on this, and there were about 20 people all told working on it, was working almost around the clock. And in fact, many of us had to sleep on the floor of the hallway outside of our production room to catch a couple of winks of sleep in the 4 days that we were producing it.
So when we got ready to put all this together in Atlanta, nowadays people think, oh, we need some video. Hook it up to the computer, suck it in there and play it back, or things like that. It wasn't as easy in those days. These were 16 to 25 megahertz computers. So one of the ways that video was compressed was to just not make it as big on the screen, be smaller, less data, or not have 30 frames per second, only 12 to 15 frames per second. But to even suck that into a computer at that rate was incredibly hard. So we would get a microwave feed from CNN every night of a lot of video stories from the checkout channel. So first we had to make it into a laser disc. If you remember, a laser disc was about a foot across, held 58,000 frames. And you could play motion video, or you could increment it 1 frame at a time, which is what we needed. So to do a 30-second video, I can't even remember the time, but it was many minutes, maybe even an hour for a long video, because it would advance 1 frame, digitize it, advance it another frame, digitize it. So we would be up a lot of hours at night just getting the video ready and edited. We didn't want to just show movies on the screen. We wanted to show this is what this technology is going to be good for. When this had been shown to Apple developers, they would play the 1984 commercial on the screen and everybody would roar with approval and say this is great. But we really wanted to show this is a real world use for video. This is CNN.com 5 years before CNN.com was launched. So this was a 4-day technology show for educators. So we were committed to providing a fresh daily news magazine or newspaper on the screen every day. These educators just seemed to never go to bed. So we couldn't get to the computer sometime till late at night. We couldn't get all this video from CNN till late at night. We had to have another edition ready at some incredibly early hour the next morning, because not only did they not go to bed, or the ones that did go to bed got up at 5 o'clock in the morning and rushed to the computers. Apple, of course, had lined the hallways with dozens and dozens of their latest computers, and up on podiums, and it was called a messaging system, because also email was a facet of it, but it was only email to reach other attendees. So instead of putting little notes up on the bulletin board that says, "Are you here?" or "I'm at the Hilton," or something like that, you would leave them a message. The nightly package that we put together was somewhere between 40 and 50 or 60 megabytes, depending on how many video stories we did. We had also provided a guide to Atlanta that let us produce some materials in advance. We didn't have to push that out every night. That stayed on all the computers, so we just had to do our updates.
Well, the networking piece was the biggest part. So, again, the distribution every night, we had 40 to 60 megabytes that we had to distribute to dozens and dozens of computers every night, and we had a very short window to do it in. The network that we were on was AppleTalk running over an Ethernet network, so it was a 10 megabit network that we had to send 40 megabytes on. I'd have to do the math on what that is now, but it took us hours to distribute everything every night. And then once everything was distributed to each computer, we had to go and bring it up on each computer and test each computer. So we had to have the network specialists to make sure that the network actually worked. We were at different physical locations, so we couldn't just hook up to the internet. We didn't have the internet that we could transfer these things on. We had to have dedicated connections from building to building, and that required serious networking expertise.
So on Sunday morning in October the 14th in 1990, this is the first thing that the conference attendees saw. Atlanta had just won the rights to the Olympics, so we had sort of had, it was their first Olympic logo here, but that one rapidly went away when they hired professionals. This is HyperCard. These are actually windows thrown up outside of HyperCard to control everything. Again, we built the magazine to not quite fill the screen, sort of like Writer's Digest, and you'll see why in a minute. This lady right here, who was a CNN anchor, became our screen agent, something like the screen agent in the Knowledge Navigator. So this is the first video that a lot of people had ever seen on a computer screen.
Welcome to News Navigator, interactive information delivery technology. This demonstration is presented by Apple Computer and CNN Headline News. You can navigate between the messaging system and News Navigator by clicking on the icons under my picture. For Headline News, I'm Anna Hovland. I'll continue to provide instruction when you click here.
And just to get this out of the way, this was a mail system here that you could use to contact other people, attendees, but that's not a part of this demo. So when you clicked here, you went to a menu of the video stories that were available. And again, we're throwing up this color on top of HyperCard. So here would be the stories of this thing. I have to lean forward a little bit. So if there was a flood somewhere, we had a story written about the flood.
Also caused flooding on New York's Long Island. Long Island Expressway looked more like a canal than a highway at one point. Meanwhile, Tropical Storm Lily is now centered about 195 miles southeast of Massachusetts' island of Nantucket. Forecasters expect the storm to weaken further tomorrow.
And so sometimes we would even just play audio because, again, we were trying to do a real news magazine that was interactive and use all the media. And there would be stories about it. I thought that I didn't want to use all of the scroll bars and everything inside of a HyperCard because they were ugly. So I hid all the black and white HyperCard stuff and developed our own buttons for scrolling through stories down here.
Go back to the home page on this one. The cover page, sorry. One of the interesting things about the way this was designed, we talked about the Knowledge Navigator. If you had a video of the Knowledge Navigator, it is laid out very similar with the little agent up in the top left-hand corner. So we followed that here. The Knowledge Navigator was iconic with this audience, and we followed it by putting Anna Hovland, our little agent, up in the top left.
All right, so we were very lucky, and some people around the world were very unlucky because there were some very important news stories that happened that week. So the first day, one of America's great composers, Leonard Bernstein, died. So we did the cover about him. Maestro dies.
He was, without a doubt, one of America's music giants. Conductor, composer, writer, teacher, Leonard Bernstein was everywhere on the stage of life. This was Bernstein with what he liked to call my orchestra, rehearsing with the New York Philharmonic in 1988. Bernstein once wrote, quote, "I believe in people. I believe in man's unconscious, the deep spring from which comes his power to communicate in love. What art can do," Bernstein wrote, "is extend this communication, magnify it, and carry it to vast, great numbers of people." For millions of music lovers, there was no better artist to carry this message.
Israel was reacting to a big UN resolution that week.
The Israeli cabinet has voted not to cooperate with the UN investigation into Monday's shooting deaths of 19 Palestinians in Jerusalem. That was good news to a group of right-wing Jewish protesters in Jerusalem today. The UN Security Council passed a resolution on Friday condemning Israeli security forces for the killings and calling for a UN team to look into the circumstances surrounding the violence. But Israel's deputy foreign minister says the team is not welcome in Israel. Israel says it's appointed its own team to look into the incident.
So you'll notice that there are no control bars in QuickTime yet. They hadn't invented them. The only way to control the video was to click it once to start and click it twice to stop.
The band that sings about fun in the sun is preaching educational responsibility. Beach Boys member Mike Love has founded Project Teach, an organization to help recruit and aid new teachers. The group staged a benefit concert for Project Teach yesterday.
So somebody at the event might decide, I'm not going to watch that, I've had enough of that, and they would click it and stop it and perhaps go. Now you could go from card to card with HyperCard, and there are HyperCard buttons underneath these graphics that we've covered up with color. There were some stories that did not have video. There were sports stories.
Most football fans would agree that it is almost inconceivable that the San Francisco 49ers and Joe Montana could actually get better. But their performance against the Falcons during Week 6 of the NFL season was flat out incredible. Montana passed for a career-high 476 yards and 6 touchdowns, with Jerry Rice catching a league record-tying 5 scoring passes in the 45-35 Niners victory.
We also did a guide to Atlanta because this was these people were 4,000 tourists. They weren't just attendees. So some of the stories would have video. The Carter Library is in Atlanta.
In October 1986, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter inaugurated the Carter Center. They dedicated the Atlanta-based organization to alleviating conflict and suffering throughout the world.
President Jimmy Carter, illumined by thee, did not erect a monument to himself. This is a lighthouse, shedding its light far and beyond the boundaries of our nation.
So we had other features in Atlanta like that, and some things without video, things about the theater and music and things like that. And on Tuesday, the big news event was Gorbachev winning the Nobel Prize. Anna also had other help screens after the first one, the screen agent did. So if you were inside of the magazine, she had some news, a little bit gratuitous, but
You can move through News Navigator by clicking on the arrows at the top of the page, or go directly to topics by clicking on the text. You can navigate between the messaging system and News Navigator by clicking on the icons under my picture.
So I know it sounds stupid today to tell somebody they can click an arrow, but in those days this was new to people. The way we navigate, you didn't lick your finger and turn the page, so you clicked an arrow and things like that. So that's why she's doing that.
The Kremlin chief edged out such luminaries as Nelson Mandela and Václav Havel to become the first Soviet head of state so honored.
To me, the awarding of this prize coincides with the times which we have come to regard as a new Europe, a different Soviet Union, and a different world. I think this award is connected with these very changes.
And there was a war heating up. Things have not changed much.
Go, baby!
As the days wear on, the soldiers are beginning to get a little time off from their war games, time to relax in front of the VCR, to get out of the sun, which is, after all, hot enough to brew tea.
We actually had a weather report every day. We didn't have a person standing in front of a camera, though. Weather.com didn't exist yet. I forget where the video is. It's strange how the stories are still the same today. Haven't changed much.
The Army has begun lifting a curfew in the occupied territories that had kept more than 1 million people indoors most of the week. Women in Ramallah immediately took to the streets to hold a commemorative march for the victims of last week's shootings.
We had no control over the audio and the audio levels. They just played whatever we had. All right, we'll go back to my day's menu. Again, we only had one up there at a time. You could not go back a day or forward a day or something like that. This was the last day of the conference, and we learned what we were doing and got a little better at it as the week went along. There was a new cartoon character on television, so we of course had Bart on the cover.
Pusher, butt kisser.
Bart, you're saying butt kisser like it's a bad thing.
Huh?
Civil rights bill passed. A lot of big things happened. We did have a story on the last day about how we did the News Navigator. This is the team that produced the News Navigator. There's a young Greg Gretsch and a young Clate Sanders. Actually, I was 48 years old then when we did this, and these guys thought I was really old. They gave me, my nickname that week was Dad. The credits for the event are listed here, and again, this video that you just saw is here. We can play it again, but a minute. So Greg was the project manager, and this hasn't changed. This is what we had up at the time. A lot of these people, Greg will jump in, a lot of these people were the developers of QuickTime.
Yeah, Jim Batson was from the development team. You know, Dean Blackler, Eric Hoffert were both ATG guys that did a lot of that for us. So you have a whole bunch of editors there. Earl Casey and John Petrovich, the headline news guys, that pulled all that together for us.
Well, even in those days, there were Easter eggs where things were hidden, and so the guys got a little wild on the last day. And so if you knew to hold the option key down, for instance, my name changed to Dad. If you held Dean Blackketter, if you held the option key for Dean Blackketter.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
This is Greg in the background.
Eat the Whopper with cheese. Have a jumbo Snicker.
Leading in this, the weeks before even going to Atlanta, we would be out here in Cupertino, and we would have to produce little test videos because we didn't cut it for later discs. We just did a test video straight into there somehow. So a lot of these little things like this came from that week. Monica Norder was the marketing person for Apple, who was in charge of...
Welcome to News Navigator, interactive information delivery technology, a demonstration presented by Apple
Computer. So she was my test
and
for
CNN
before I did the news anchor.
And actually, if you option click on Anna Hovind, I think.
Oh yeah, this lady up here, she was very good, and so
she was a good sport.
Instead of saying all the mic tests for Anna were things like this.
Jumbo Snicker.
And I don't know why.
I can tell you why.
It is a great ego-building mechanism to laugh at what you once took seriously.
Whopper with cheese.
So at the time we did a lot of the demo videos, and the hardest part was we were capturing the video one frame at a time, but then lining the audio up so the lips were in sync was really challenging. And so this Whopper with cheese and a jumbo Snicker, that for some reason became the phrase that we wanted to use to make sure that we had all the lips in sync. So they were using that before Anna Hoven came along, and we thought it would be really funny to have her say those things. And so she was a good sport and did.
That was one of the big challenges in early QuickTime, was to keep things in sync, because it was a dilemma. Okay, should we play the audio and maybe have the video drop frames to keep up with the audio, or should we let the video play and drop frames of the audio? Well, if you drop frames of the audio, it distorts and you miss words, and you don't even, but it doesn't hurt, it didn't hurt to drop a few frames of video. So a lot of times getting it in sync was a big deal.
Yeah, the answer was always drop frames of video, and then as Clate said, you'd get out of sync. And how do you make sure that you're in sync? So.
And then the other, there were other, of course,
Pusher, butt kisser.
they love this.
You're saying butt kisser like it's a bad thing.
Huh?
Whopper with cheese and a jumbo Snicker.
And frankly, my dear, of course, you know where that came from Gone with the Wind.
One of my biggest memories of putting together the News Navigator was this video of Leonard Bernstein. And part of the reason why it really stuck out for me is he had just died the day before, and CNN sent over this beautifully produced piece. And I didn't know anything about the news business at the time. What I learned was that they have these obits for everybody famous already in the can, ready to go. And when someone dies, they can put together in no time a really high quality video. And obviously, since Leonard Bernstein was a very famous conductor, the background track and everything is beautiful. And
he was, without a doubt, one of America's music giants. Conductor, composer, writer, teacher, Leonard Bernstein was everywhere on the stage of life. This was Bernstein with what he liked to call my orchestra, rehearsing with the New York Philharmonic in 1988.
as we were capturing these videos, we had to go over them again and again and again. And they're short videos, you know, they're 20 seconds or whatever. So by the end of the 4 nights, we could recite almost all of the copy from the entire thing. And the Leonard Bernstein one was a case in point. We knew all the words, all the music, everything by the end of the show. Let's see. Go back to our contents. I think I must have been asleep by Wednesday because I don't remember the Bart Simpson. I mean, I remember Butt Kisser, but I don't remember the rest of the Bart Simpson one. You know, one of the things, somewhat, it's funny to us right now. You would think you just click anywhere, but of course back then you have to click here to go into it.
Well, somewhere there's a HyperCard script that says get the click. And if it's in this rectangle, do this. You know, that movie of Anna up there was not sensitive to the click. It's just that if you click in that region, she's going to play.
Right. Bush ratings plummet. Different Bush, not the second one. Let's see. What's that? What are you looking at? Apartheid law?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously really big news. South Africa dropping its apartheid law.
At Johannesburg Central Park, a visitor could be forgiven for thinking apartheid has long been dead. Facilities are already open to all races, and the demise of the notorious Separate Amenities Act is warmly welcomed.
Everyone will be free, and will be happy, and will be equal, always in place.
I feel great. It's like we've been waiting for
this moment for such a long time, and when freedom is here, we have to use it. I think we all have to be equal.
One of the things that we noticed was when we put it out there, a lot of people would go in and they would start at the first one once they figured out what it was, and they would go from page to page to page, going through the whole thing and watching every one of the videos. Since the videos were only 20 or 30 seconds each, watching all of them didn't actually take that long. And of course, the design element, we moved where you want to click around on the different days. Did you notice that's in a different spot?
And we actually had the debate among the marketing people at Apple whether we could put butt kisser up there or not. Yeah, you could click over there also.
Yeah, you could click on any of these, or you could click on the individual things here. So entertainment would take you to the butt kisser one. Bart Simpson.
Pusher, butt kisser.
Bart, you're saying butt kisser like it's a bad thing.
Huh?
We're having a wonderful time in St. Hill. Don't use the internet.
Yeah, you know, for the production of this, when you look through the credits, you see we had network gurus, we had software, software specialists, which were really the people that wrote QuickTime, Warhol, that could actually program things every night that we needed it. We had to have every different component. Today, one person could do most of this. Back then, you needed to have specialists for each part of it to pull this off.
Well, there were not a lot of options of layout.
I was going to say, once we came up with a template, we followed it.
Yeah, there were not a lot of options for layout and things like that. There was no way we were going to wrap the text around a movie or something like that. These were just little blocks of text. As a matter of fact, somewhere in the background, maybe I'll show you what's behind the screen. This is a HyperCard window here. And you see, I have hidden all the ugly HyperCard stuff, like bars around windows, or maybe I would even put white paint over the scroll bars, because I thought they were ugly, and put my own scroll bars down here. So I thought everything was ugly and wanted it to look more modern and not look like HyperCard. Unless people recognize this little pointer, this little finger pointer here, they probably didn't even realize it was HyperCard. I like to think the next conference, some of the Apple people also supported me. Greg came to the next conference. At some point, and I don't know this is true, maybe I dreamed it, but at some point some engineer was looking over my shoulder, and I was taking little HyperCard buttons and arrows and blocks and building a way to control HyperCard under the HyperCard window. And you could actually control the HyperCard, the movie, with those little blocks. And I remember that engineer looking over my shoulder and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, nobody knows how to play a movie just by poking it, I said, "You got to have some controls on it." The rest is history. He may have already been working on it, I don't know.
You got to ask Jim Batson about that. That would have been Jim.
I don't expect that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at first the control bar, it looks very sophisticated today, but at first the control bar did look like VCR controls or something.
Yeah, start, stop.
So all this stuff was not available. This was all hidden, and you locked the user out. The user couldn't get these editing tools. I just left them in the day in case I needed to get to them.
So when you erase that white paint you put over the scroll bar, so like, is that now on every card, or?
No, it's just this one.
Oh, okay.
Every card was done the same. We couldn't use a template. There are a few templates that I reused, but I would have to do little things like make the window a little bigger or not quite as big, make a block of text fit, you know.
I'll bet, actually, in fact, I saw it. I was going to say you probably changed font sizes too.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
little tricks that people learned in desktop publishing. Change the font size a little bit, and then you can, it'll fit in your space, right?
Well, actually, typesetters in newspapers, they actually do that too, you know.
Yeah.
And these things over here, they're not even HyperCard. They're just windows thrown up there. And, I'll give you a little HyperCard lesson here. This is what, it's hard to do, but I'll bring it up. This is what a HyperTalk looked like. So on OpenStack, show the title bar or hide the title bar. On the close stack, if there's a window called Wednesday cover, close it. If there's close the window mail, close all these windows out here. On startup, set the user level to 5. Hide the menu bar, hide the title bar. So you can just use these English terms in this language, you know. Put that there, do this. It ignored capital letters, it ignored spaces. If you put 2 spaces, a modern program like JavaScript or C would just stop and not even telling you why it was stopping, you know. So this was very good for people who were, as Greg said, unsophisticated programmers. So I was an unsophisticated program. Display the image Educom marble, so this was thrown up here. Show the window mail, so it was very, very English-like.
HyperTalk eventually was the basis for AppleScript, correct?
I don't know. I know that parts of it, I mean, some of the language was similar, but AppleScript has never gotten this sort of widespread adoption or use that HyperTalk or HyperCard got. HyperCard was just so easy and so revolutionary at the time, and you know, teachers all over the world that didn't have any programming expertise were creating valuable content using it.
So yeah, HyperTalk was the language behind it, and that had some influence on AppleScript, I guess.
Yeah,
I'm gonna put this screen back.
Yeah, put it back to what it's supposed to be. Clate's in there, you know, changing it all. So now it's the thing that was great about HyperCard is when you make a change, it's permanent. The thing that's bad about it is he just made those changes that are permanent now to something.
He can't undo them, right? He has to repaint it back.
Yep. See, so that's what he's doing. He's painting it back. Yeah, so what we would do is we had the, you know, he was working on the master, and once he had that stack done, we just had to replace that stack every place. So it was essentially that one file. Well, just replacing the stack, we had to go, I'd have to think about it, and I'd have to ask Dean how we did the I think we telnetted to each machine, and because it wasn't like you could just mount the drives on remote machines and that sort of thing. It was more complicated than that. But I think at the time, we would just move everything over. And you know, if we had a place that we put it all, and you'd have to go to each machine, take it out, and put it where it's supposed to be. So if we did make those changes, you know, oh, everything's perfect except, you know, you broke whatever the opening video or something, you'd have to fix it, and then we'd have to redistribute it, and then we'd have to go to each of the machines, put it in the right place, and then test it.
Well, there was some sneakernet involved too.
Yes, sneakernet was an important part of it.
Like the distant hotels, and we were doing everything just to get through that I may have done. We might take a little hard drive to another hotel and put it on one machine and then file share to the other machines or something like that. So it was just whatever tools we had, we were spinning plates.
Yeah, a lot of spinning plates. I know that one morning we had to resend out the HyperCard stack. I don't even remember why it was. But anytime stuff like that happened, you know, we get things out there and we get it all almost working, and then, oh my God, it's 5:30 in the morning. We have to be up by 6, and this isn't working. How do we do this? And so everyone would have to scramble to get the update done, and then get the update distributed, and then bring it back up and test it.
How many testers were there?
How many what?
Testers.
Testers? Everyone was a tester. I mean, I think,
everybody was awake.
Yeah, exactly. We didn't have dedicated testers per se. My job was probably as much testing as it was anything else. Once you put things out on the computers, you had to make sure that it was working. And we had to physically touch every single system out there and run through the paces on every system. So there were a whole bunch of different people involved in that, and it could have been anyone. It could have been the video guys, it could have been our editors, it could have been anybody. Basically, as Clate said, anyone who was awake was a tester when it came time to deploy it.
And you had to have security guards, not to keep someone from stealing the computers, because they were too heavy and big to steal in those days. The security guards were to make people stay off of them so we could get our job done. There'd be some crazy guy from Des Moines up at 3 in the morning
trying to use the terminal.
Trying to use it.
Yeah.
Republicans have a habit of believing that to get economic growth, you have to have everything start with those in the high income bracket, and hopefully some of it, under their theory, will come down to the lower income people. We're trying to provide economic incentives for savings and growth for the middle income people of America. The middle income people of America are the most productive people. They pay the most taxes. Unfortunately, they're the least considered many times when tax proposals are being put together.
That was a senator from Georgia.
How are you going to the? How are you going to the?
What do you want?
Go to the.
Greg, I've been resurrecting all this, and so this afternoon's the first time Greg has seen it in 27 years.
Other than the videos you've seen.
Yeah, I've made a few videos.
Can you go to that one? Not that one. This one. Which one did you? Where do you have the info page?
About the team?
Yeah.
You want the
no, not the one about the team. The one with the icons on the bottom that have each of the days.
Oh, that's that. In case you got a copy of that, there's a hidden button on the contents page.
Okay.
It's up there that goes back to there.
Got it. Okay.
And then the different days there. I sent you this about 3 weeks ago.
You sent me this picture, yeah.
And said, do you have any comments? Do you have any changes you want to make in this?
And I didn't.
No, you didn't. All right.
Well, when I read that, I'm like, did we do this at the time? Was that no. Clate did that now.
No, that page wasn't a part of it.
Yeah, actually, when you look at the 20-person team, I mean, you look at all those people that are there. That's Peter Marks. Is he on the list there? Oh, he is.
Yeah,
Basic Science. Yeah. Jim Batson.
I don't know who that is. That girl beside me.
I don't remember that. That's me.
Dean.
There's Clate. Clate had a little bit more hair then than he has now.
I got a little more weight though.
Mm-hmm.
And the last person in the list was my wife, who developed the Atlanta Guide and ran down all the videos and all that, and got that in there.
I think Clate mentioned earlier that the mail system that you had hooked up to was actually a Microsoft mail system?
Yeah, originally when we launched it, we used Microsoft Mail, and Microsoft Mail, you think of Apple versus Microsoft in the early 90s. I know working as an employee at Apple at the time, I didn't have really good feelings about Microsoft, but it was either Microsoft Mail or QMail, which I think it was QMail, which was another mail program. And the challenge was the guys from QMail wouldn't return my phone calls and wouldn't do anything for me. The guys from Microsoft, was actually a woman who was the product manager who jumped through hoops to get me everything that we needed. And the X commands that we talked about using for QuickTime, she had her team that was building Microsoft Mail produce a whole set of X commands that we could use inside of HyperCard so that we could run, launch the email from within HyperCard. So they did a fantastic job of helping us and making it work. But at the time, email wasn't a global phenomenon. So it wasn't that you were using Microsoft Mail to get to another mail system. Everyone at the conference was given an email address for the conference, and they were sending email to each other within the conference. And what happened, I don't know whether it was the first day or what have you, or maybe it was even before, we came to the realization that a lot of these people wanted to use Telnet to log into their mainframes back, or their Unix systems or what have you, back at their campuses to get access to their campus email. And so we had to add Telnet to the application suite, if you will, so that they could do that.
And the first event that we did, we let people on their first use of the machine, invent their own passcode.
Yeah.
And if you like you do now with things, it didn't occur to us that some clown would come up and register as somebody else and send email in his name to a couple of people. So later we learned that maybe that's not a good idea to let people use their own password.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can click it, Greg.
Well, it'll just
right now it's just a dialogue.
Yeah, mail not included. There you go.
In this demo. Yeah. So we essentially, people didn't realize it was Microsoft Mail because it was totally a HyperCard interface to Microsoft Mail. And it went to a screen to do that, and to that screen we added some other networking protocols like Telnet.
Yeah, at the time Microsoft Mail was a workgroup mail program. It wasn't.
And campus academics didn't just use Telnet for email. They could get into their mainframe and change some student's grade or to check their roll or do things like that, and then academic budgets and things like that. And so these were high-level academic people that are at this conference. It wasn't just teachers, it was important people, college presidents and people like that. Oh, wow. And I'm sure they went home and said, why can't we do something like that on our campus? Which was the idea.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of the basic template layout, all this kind of stuff, we shot that video of Anna Hoven, I don't know, weeks or months before.
I think it was the night before.
No, it wasn't. It was at least a week or two before that. Because we had to go, I remember we went into CNN and because we shot that at CNN.
Yeah,
and
I thought it was at the last minute, but and we used Monica Norder as a dummy for that until we got over there and did it.
Until we got over there to do it.
Well, I went to California several weekends in the months and weeks before that, and we did go through practice sessions there because all this was new to us and developed
we had to
generally what we were going to do.
But QuickTime, Warhol, what was the code name at the time, it didn't work until, the reason that Jim Batson, part of the QuickTime team, was on site with us in Atlanta is because he was having to make changes to it every day to make sure it worked. We had different bugs every day that kept popping up. And we needed someone there. We were holding it together with baling wire and bubble gum.
So a week after the conference, I think, wow, that was cool. And I don't know why I saved it all. It's just, I don't know why. But anyway, so Greg calls me up and says, hey, Clay, did you save anything? And I said, I think I saved everything. He said, well, Scully wants a best-of demo to cut a CD and carry around to show to a bunch of big shots in New York. And so he said, bring everything you got to California and put it together out here. So I don't know, I went out there for 2 or 3 days or something and sort of made one day that had all the best videos in it, sort of the best of, and did that for Scully to show off. And I'm sure he carried it around and say, look what I did. But so a week goes by and I call up Greg and I say, Greg, can I have a copy of that CD? And Greg says, I'm sorry, it's proprietary and I can't give you a copy right now.
Proprietary, yeah.
I can't give you
that
a copy
whole thing
right
you
now.
produced,
I said,
you can't touch
I
it
got all
anymore.
the files, I got it all. Why can't I have this? I want a nice compact CD to save for posterity. Yeah. He promised me he'd give it to me one day.
I did. I gave it to you.
No, I never had a copy.
I gave it to you last fall.
Oh, so that compact thing is what you sent me?
No.
No. The thing that I sent you, I have no idea. But
you sent me some floppy files.
They weren't floppy files because it was 60 meg. The thing that Dean sent me, and I sent it to Hanson too.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was. I don't know if that was the thing you had produced or not, but it was definitely a single compact version of it. I think that that specific CD is lost to the.
Oh yeah, and of course it only worked for about 6 months anyway, and then all the software changed.
Yeah.
And
everything stopped working.
So that was it. It was great fun. It was a big event in my life. This was a very hard thing to do. Very hard. A lot of this stuff is kludges, of just making it work for a week. Some of the things seem crude right now. But it became something very big in my life because a week after this event or 2 weeks after this event, another group at Apple, and Apple had all these groups in charge of different industries. So somebody else called me and said, can you do this at our event in Miami? And I said, well, you know, we're not going to get CNN to go from city to city doing these things, so we'll have to come up with some other uses of the video, like things about your conference or your speakers or Guide to Miami or things like that. And so I did one for another group in Miami, and then later somebody called and said, we do this in St. Louis. And so I did this for 2 or 3 years, and then other people started calling me. Gardner Group, Cisco, NCR, PeopleSoft. Wow. I did this for 15 years, but then people gradually started having their computers in their pocket. They didn't depend on Apple or somebody else to provide computers at an event, and so it sort of like being a blacksmith, you know. One day the horses went away and my business went away. So, but it was very good for me and good for my family.
Could you talk about how the advent of the World Wide Web changed things for you?
So Apple sponsored these events at a lot of trade shows and things, but marketing strategies changed, CEOs changed, and so they got tired of paying for them and things like that. And then other groups did not want to use strictly Apple products. They wanted to go to PCs and things like that. And then the web came out with HTML. So gradually I transitioned the business to providing services as web pages, and did them all over the world for groups like Gartner, Cisco, NPR, PeopleSoft. So it was certainly good for me and my family and my kids' college education.
Yeah, so the way to think about it, I was kind of the executive producer, so I assembled the team who, and begged, borrowed, and stole the resources from wherever I could get them. Clate was the producer, if you will, of the HyperCard program that went out every day. The individual stories, I don't even remember who decided, but it was, it was very, I just remember being very obvious every day. But the content, we had to deal with CNN. They piped the video over. We had some editors there working with us. And they would assemble a package which was video from CNN, so Christiane Amanpour or whoever it was, video from CNN and news story from AP or USA Today or whatever the news story was from, and assemble it into a package. And Clate would put a bow around it all, make sure everything worked, and make sure all the components were in there, and we'd ship it.
It was a little more complicated than that. Like Prissy said in Gone with the Wind, which she said, me and Miss Scarlett done had a fine baby boy, but it was mostly me. So I had to, I actually did all the pages, and I manipulated all this stuff. And it was a little bit like paper was, but paper's gone away now, but in paper in the 90s, where you would write stories to fit, and when you got down toward the last and it didn't fit, you cut something off.
You move it a pixel this way, you move it a pixel that way, you move, right?
So I had to make these stories fit in the space around those things and edit to that, and so I actually wrote did all the HyperCard, put it all together, and at some point said, okay, it's done, blast it out there. And I'm sure once or twice during the week, somebody came back from looking at the machines and says, you forgot so-and-so.
Oh, that absolutely happened. Like in the mornings, the thing was, the critical thing was getting the videos out to the machine, the 40 meg or whatever it was. It was mostly video. And there were absolutely times that we shipped the video out first and then shipped an updated version of the HyperCard stack later because we changed something, it wasn't done, that sort of thing.
Or you would click something and nothing happened.
And nothing happened, right. And so then it was like one line in HyperCard that had to change. And because he changed that one line in HyperCard, we had to go to all those machines, ship it back over, bring it back up, test it on each of the machines. Yeah.
But that's different, that's an advantage, because nowadays when a newspaper went out, you had to make the correction the next day and with an apology. But we could do all these things instantly, just like CNN does today. A story disappears or a story gets updated all the time.
So we were at the Inforum. And Educom, and I don't even know if the Inforum still exists in Atlanta, but it was actually fairly new at the time. It was a conference center right in the middle of Atlanta. And then there were a couple of hotels around the Inforum where most of the guests were and where the conference sort of bled into. And we were between those. One of them was the Omni, and I don't remember what the other ones were. But we were between those different places. And Clate was right. He said, I can't remember. I mean, you couldn't just there was no World Wide Web, there was no internet to just plug it into the internet and pipe stuff over. We had a dedicated line going from the Inforum to each of the hotels, and we had to distribute to each of the hotels and each of the systems, around the conference.
But the halls there would be halls at it's the conference, the convention, and Apple would have little pedestals there. So
with the little drapes over it, and
so it'd be stand-up pedestals with a computer there, and you would walk up to them and use them. And people would get in line. People would form lines behind each one, like in the supermarket, behind the cash register, for an opportunity to get to it.
This was a time before laptops. No one had laptops. People traveled with the briefcase and papers in them. They weren't traveling with computers. And for these educators, at that time, most of them had access to DARPANet, et cetera. They had email on their college campuses, and so they would want to come to this kiosk and essentially access their email. And midway through the conference, we realized a lot of them wanted to telnet into their systems back in their schools, and so we had to put a little link to a telnet app so that they could launch into telnet from the application as well. Yeah, we had production constraints. Like it took time to build it in. We had a single HyperCard stack that everything was linked into, and in order to put a new story on there, we had to swap out that HyperCard stack on every one of those systems. So yeah, I mean, it was amazing at the time because no one had ever done anything like this. But when you think about it in the context of today, if a breaking news story happens, it's on your computer, on your iPhone immediately. There, we would still have to wait until the next day. This was more akin to a newspaper where, okay, when we hit that deadline, you can't come out with anything new. If a huge story happened at 12:01, we might push back a few minutes. I don't remember if we ever actually had that, but we pretty much set a deadline of whenever the deadline was, that's what we're working with for the next day. It was great. They actually didn't do anything from a production standpoint other than give us the pipe to the video. And Earl Casey, who was a vice president at CNN at the time, he came over regularly just to see what we were doing. For them, it was an education thing, but they were very accommodating, very helpful in getting us everything that we needed.
These were their stories that they were pushing out through the checkout lanes of supermarkets all across the country, so they just pushed them out there to us.
Yeah, they didn't have to produce any new content for this. 6 months after this, we produced another project with CNN that was actually a weekly news magazine on CD-ROM, and for that they produced a lot of specific content. And this was just done as a demo, and it never saw the light of day. It was used for a lot of different demos, but what we were trying to do is see if we could put together a weekly news digest that had video news that would be a piece of reference, reference material for schools and that sort of thing, so that years later you could look back and still have access to videos from events that happened years ago. Now that's YouTube, but.
So I can add one more thing. So like originally Greg called me up and said, do you know anybody at CNN, or can you help us do this? So Greg calls in October and says, do you still happen to have all that stuff? And being a little bit of a pack rat, I still had all the files. Not only that, I still had computers that would run them. So this stuff wouldn't play on a modern computer. This is running on a system 6.07 or something like that on an ancient Macintosh. So not only do you need to save the software, you need to save the hardware that will play it.
Yeah, and when you say October, I thought you were talking about the October afterwards. You're talking about this past October, almost 20.
So it's been 27 years since we did this, and I still have the things to run it, which is why this museum can see it.
Well, we talked about that. We were talking about that at lunch. In maybe 10 years, in some period of time, you would never be able to get this thing back up and running again. And when that happens, it's lost forever. And a big part of what we wanted to do when we started talking about this back in October is, well, if we can get it up and running, let's shoot video of it. And then even though you won't have the application being able to run, at least you'll be able to see it in 20 or 30 or 40 years or what have you. So, because the media will never die. It'll just change formats.
I mean, I think for me, the News Navigator is interesting because it's sort of, besides just being the first public demo of QuickTime, it sort of sits in this trajectory of the development of multimedia.
For sure.
And so you already had HyperCard, and QuickTime this is the first sort of integration of QuickTime with HyperCard. Prior to this, you had systems that Apple had done, like the Visual Almanac, which were HyperCard stacks controlling Laserdiscs.
Yep,
yeah,
exactly.
with Laserdisc players.
And the Laserdisc showing on the television monitor,
right?
Not on the computer screen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so then you have that, and then then you go to this, and then soon after this, you're able to do this entire thing on a CD-ROM.
On a CD-ROM. This was predated CD-ROM.
Right.
I mean, CD-ROMs existed, but they were not at all in widespread use yet. And then over the next couple of years, CD-ROM came into widespread use, and you're absolutely right. In the early days of QuickTime made a lot of sense because you could put these videos on a CD-ROM, you had enough storage space, and have interesting content there. When you talked earlier about the World Wide Web, with the emergence of the World Wide Web, the thing that happened with World Wide Web when it first came out, you had access to everything at your fingertips, but you had access to it through a 14.4 modem or a 56K modem. So you had an ocean of data that you could sift through. Those coffee straws that are the little tiny coffee straws. That's about all you could do, and it didn't give you the ability then in the early days of the internet to do video. It wasn't until broadband came into fairly broad adoption, really post 2000, before video came back to the web and became a big part of the web. And now, of course, every child today, everyone that was born post 1995 thinks that computers are video devices. And that certainly wasn't the case.
Yeah.
All right, finally crashed.
Yeah, well, it wasn't. While it was a demonstration, it wasn't a demo. It was a usable news magazine. So you would go. I mean, it was literally it was bigger than that, with that black thing over it and a computer sitting on top. And you would go up to it, and there's a keyboard and a mouse, and these were set up to revert back to the home page as soon as someone was done with it. It would wait a few minutes, and then it would revert back to the home page. And so if you came up to the system and no one had touched it for a few minutes, it would be sitting on the home page, and you would just go through. And there were people going through every single page, watching every single video.
And they were accustomed to these kinds of services to be available at these techno conferences. And these were fairly sophisticated technical people from universities, so they were very accustomed to it. And so they expected these things to be there.
They expected telnet terminals.
Yeah.
This is a lot more than
all the sexy stuff was a surprise to them. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a little bit more sophisticated.
And this got a lot of write-up in the technical industry and across the country and things like that. What we were most proud of is that it was not just showing off a video. It was not just playing the 1984 commercial. It was showing a real world use of how this technology will be used in the next few years.
Yeah. And eventually this kind of content would all be on the web. They would move to CD-ROM and then to the web.
Yeah, once you got to broadband, then that looks like a pretty unsophisticated web page from like 1996 or 1998. But in 1996 or 1998, they wouldn't have had any video on it. It wouldn't have been until 2000, 2001, 2002 that they had video on.
Yeah, this was about a year before Tim Berners-Lee started thinking about the World Wide Web, and that was just links to scientific papers. This was about 3 years before Netscape, Mosaic, things like that, and then it was 5 years before CNN.com.
But I think it's interesting that the kinds of things that people wanted to do on the web, people already wanted to do before the web. And they were trying to do it with whatever technologies that they could come up with. And this, at the 1990, was what they used to make that vision happen. And of course, later on, everybody would use the web, but at this early stage,
this is the way you did it. That's you know this better than I. That's the history of the whole technology industry. When I was at Apple from '88 to '92, there was a gentleman in the Advanced Technology Group at the time named Kai-Fu Lee, who has become. He was well known then. He's become very famous since, but he was working on voice recognition, and Siri didn't come into being until whatever 4 or 5 years ago, and Google, Google's product, and Alexa and all these things, and it's still not mainstream. But it's not that voice was new when Siri came around. It wasn't. It had been, being worked on and iterated on for decades, literally. And AI now is the thing everyone's talking about, and AI has been around. We were doing neural nets in 1989, and so, each of these things, as the state of the underlying technology advances, it makes the visions of long ago much more possible in ways that were partially thought of, but not at all completely thought of. Some of the things that we see today, you see, I guess, echoes of what we were doing here in the stuff you see today, but you also see completely new things that we never contemplated. Mm-hmm. No one contemplated back then, although I guess the Knowledge Navigator kind of showed this, but we weren't contemplating carrying a device in our pocket that had the kind of bandwidth and ability. I can sit down and watch a football game live on a device in my pocket right now. We didn't think about that back then. We were trying to figure out how to take analog video and make it digital, at a 60 to, it took us 60 times as long or something like that to compress it as it took us to play it back. There was this big asymmetrical compression, decompression issue for us back then. And now everything's digital from the beginning, and I can watch a live football game on my iPhone.
What good is virtual reality?
Yeah, to the point, right? These things, virtual reality was being talked about in 1990.
Welcome to Tomorrowland. At North Carolina State's Virtual Environment Laboratory, computer technology lets landscape designers model nature to dream up the forests and wetlands of the future.
Just imagine yourself in a canoe on this water surface here, and we're going to be moving along the channels that we've created to move the water through this wetland site.
Ecologists and landscape designers think high-tech computer modeling can help them focus their imagination, help them create compelling, irresistible dreams of turning barren wasteland into nature's wonderland.
It'll never happen.